introduction, Steve, and for the opportunity to speak before such a distinguished audience this morning. I also want to acknowledge Steve's leadership in helping to make Juneteenth a national holiday. Let's give Steve a round of applause. Especially after the death of our dear friend, Dr. Ronald Myers. Now, Doc, as you know, was the visionary who was instrumental in getting 43 states to make Juneteenth a state holiday or observance. And Doc traveled thousands of miles for nearly 25 years advocating for a national holiday, and unfortunately passed away before it was signed into law. In his efforts, supported by organizations and countless individuals across the nation, including Ms. Opal Lee, our national treasure, and many of you in this room are the reason why we're able to celebrate this morning. And I was grateful when Representative Danny Davis from Illinois read a special tribute to Doc into the Congressional Record in 2021. To inform people why this day is significant in American history, Doc would give a copy of my book, Juneteenth, A Celebration of Freedom, to every governor who made Juneteenth a holiday or observance, even to Alaska's Governor Sarah Palin at the time. Doc made great things possible because he combined his unwavering faith with action. And if there's any politicians in this room, you know that getting states to agree on anything is a miracle. But Doc truly believed that he could get red states and blue states and even the federal government to recognize this holiday that represented freedom to blacks. And Doc was so passionate because he knew that Juneteenth meant more than just the enslaved blacks in Texas finding out after the war had ended that they had been freed. Doc knew that the legacy of slavery still impacts our lives, and that Juneteenth's promise of freedom gives us the faith to continue our struggle. Now, the legacy of slavery reminds us that at every significant period in this country's history, whether it was the indentured servant period, the slavery era, Reconstruction, or the Jim Crow era, the promise of freedom was deferred. And I want to talk about some of that history this morning for the next 15 minutes because I don't think it's possible to understand the true meaning of Juneteenth without an understanding of Black history and the legacy of slavery. To understand what Juneteenth meant to enslaved blacks is to understand Juneteenth. Sometimes we need to look backward in order to move forward. Although enslavement has influenced nearly every aspect of American life since 1619, students still graduate with a misrepresentation of how enslavement shaped race relations and how its legacy still affects the lives of all of us. And when we are candid about Black history, everyone benefits because facing our history honestly is key to racial reconciliation and understanding our present circumstances. That's why we must challenge the history we've been taught and face the difficult truth about America's past as experienced by Black people rather than lying about it or trying to ban it from being taught. And besides, if they ban it from our schools, we'll teach it in our homes, in our churches, and in our organizations because the truth matters and our history is too consequential to be erased. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
When Europeans brought the first Africans to Virginia in 1619, they were treated as indentured servants because slavery wasn't yet legal in colonial law. Lawyer and scholar Dr. Jacqueline Badalora explains that from 1620 to 1675, British and African indentured servants worked, ate, and slept together, living under similar conditions. They could own servants, vote, and marry British women. There were many interracial marriages during this period, and for a brief time in our history, in the colonies, class differences may have been more significant than racial differences. However, this harmony ended after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, which united Black and white indentured servants against Virginia's governor and ruling elite. Prior to Bacon's Rebellion, it was estimated that 25% of Virginia's free men, Black and white men who had completed their indenture, were without land of their own. Their petition to the colonial government for land was denied, and as a result, poor whites, natives, and Blacks who were furious united under Nathaniel Bacon, who led them to march into Jamestown and burned it to the ground. Bacon died of dysentery during the rebellion, and British troops were able to suppress the uprising, ending the indentured system for blacks. Now, after Bacon's rebellion, rich planners described the unity between poor whites and blacks as a troubling alliance against the ruling elite, a direct threat to their rule. And so they responded by creating a divide and conquer solution based on race, and by doing so, officially introduced racism into law and customs. They passed anti-black laws ranging from banning blacks from owning weapons or voting to making them slaves for life. Now, in return for supporting the new slave policies, poor whites were given just enough racial privileges so that they can identify with their race rather than their class. Yeah. After Bacon's rebellion, we see the emergence of the term white people, which Professor Badalora argues did not exist until 1681. Before then, whites were identified by their countries of origin, like France or Poland or Ireland. She says whiteness became a tool to divide laborers. The rich planters effectively used racism to destroy class unity among poor people, replacing it with racial animosity that persists to this day. And so the promise of freedom was deferred. Now just imagine if poor whites and blacks had taken over Virginia during Bacon's rebellion. We'd have a different America today. And as white colonists passed additional anti-black laws, ultimately making blacks chattel property, which meant that blacks could be sold, bartered, rented, deeded, used as collateral, and treated like farm animals. Frederick Douglass said, "We have worked without wages. We have lived without hope, wept without sympathy, and bled without mercy." Despite living under such inhumane conditions, blacks fought and died in every war for America. That's why the American flag also belongs to black people. When Paul Revere rode through the countryside waking up Minutemen, he woke up black Minutemen as well. When George Washington crossed the Delaware River, blacks were in the boat with him. We marched in every war, but when they signed the Constitution, they wrote that black lives were worth only 3/5 of a white person's life. The truth matters. Up until 1808, when the transatlantic slave trade was finally outlawed, most of the enslaved blacks came from Africa. After the transatlantic trade ended, the majority of the enslaved blacks were born in the US and became part of the domestic slave trade. Now, most history books just gloss over the domestic slave scene as if it were insignificant. But in reality, it was far larger than the transatlantic trade and just as pernicious. More than 1 million blacks were sold to slavers in the Deep South from Virginia, Maryland, and other slave states during the domestic slave trade. That's double the number that were brought over from Africa. Now, whether brought here or born here, the average enslaved person did not take slavery lying down. They resisted in every way they could. Harriet Tubman, known as Moses by her people, led hundreds of blacks to freedom. She said, "If you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If they're shouting after you, keep going. Don't ever stop, keep going. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going." By the end of 1863, it's estimated that over 400,000 black people had escaped their plantations to Union lines, running towards the freedom guaranteed by the Emancipation Proclamation. And they had help from many white allies too, from Harriet Beecher Stowe to William Lloyd Garrison to John Brown, who joined the fight. By the start of the Civil War, there are estimates of over 250,000 black and white abolitionists in the US, as well as thousands more who served in the Underground Railroad, risking their lives. And I admit, I admire the many, many thousands of black and white abolitionists who served in the Underground Railroad because they depended on each other and supported each other and modeled the type of race relations we could benefit from today. And we may not know their names, but we know what they did. They fought and died together to end slavery and to save this country. And these folks should be our heroes, not some racist Confederates they built monuments to or popularized in movies and Westerns. The Underground Railroad was more than just a pathway to freedom. It was a powerful testimony of people standing together during our darkest hour. At the end of the Civil War, there were still enslaved blacks in Texas and Oklahoma. And when General George Granger joined thousands of colored troops in Galveston, Texas, one can imagine the joy in the hearts of our enslaved ancestors. The record tells us when they heard the news of freedom on June 19, 1865, the first Juneteenth, they alternately sang, danced, and prayed. There was much rejoicing and jubilation that their lifelong prayers had finally been answered. Many of the enslaved left their plantations immediately upon being freed, in search of family members, economic opportunities, or simply because they could. They left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and hope in their hearts. Oh, freedom. And as blacks emerged from this long, dark night, there was this great promise that for the first time since they had been in this land, the U.S. Constitution would protect them. There was great optimism for the future, but few realized slavery's bitter legacy was just beginning to unfold, and that equality was to remain an elusive dream. Oh, freedom. Frederick Douglass said, they freed us, but they didn't change their attitude about us. The Civil War may have ended slavery, but not anti-black racism. There was no racial reconciliation commission or apology for slavery, or no plan to make the transition from enslavement to freedom go smoothly. Ex-slaves were, as Frederick Douglass said, free without roofs to cover them, or bread to eat, or land to cultivate, and as a consequence, died in such numbers as to awaken the hope of their enemies that they would soon disappear. And black people all over the South were pleading with Union officials, do not abolish slavery and leave us landless. Do not force us to work for our former masters and call that freedom. Just give us some land and we'll be okay. Now keep in mind that these newly freed blacks were highly skilled blacksmiths, shoemakers, carpenters, artisans, musicians, farmers, midwives, overseers, house managers, cooks, and gardeners. It was their skill set that made these plantations entirely self-sufficient. All they needed was land. They didn't need a master. The so-called master needed them. And the period after the Civil War ended is known as Reconstruction, because the South had to be rebuilt and the country had to be reunited. And when the Civil War ended, slave owners acted like they had won the war. And they felt this way because during the early years of Reconstruction, Vice President Andrew Johnson, a former slave owner, became president after Lincoln was assassinated. And Johnson allowed the Confederate leaders to return to their old positions of power. Now, the Germans didn't let the Nazis return to power after World War II. And the first laws the Confederates enacted were called the Black Codes, which prohibited blacks from owning property, conducting business, or buying land. That's not freedom, my friends. Once again, the promise of freedom was deferred. Confederates blamed blacks for the loss of the war and took their wrath out on them, killing blacks every day during the early years of Reconstruction, until the radical Republicans passed legislation over Johnson's veto that gave blacks some temporary relief and sent federal troops to the South to protect them. But that only lasted until the Compromise of 1877, when the troops were withdrawn and the rights of blacks were no longer guaranteed. Now, we've had troops in Korea since the end of the Korean War. We've had troops in Germany since the end of World War II. What if we could have left troops in the South long enough to secure the rights for blacks to live in peace? And when blacks were abandoned to the will of former slave owners, these Confederates replaced Reconstruction with two dire options for most blacks. One was sharecropping, which would keep blacks indebted and poor for over 100 years after slavery's end, guaranteeing that most blacks didn't even have the opportunity to break out of poverty because of the sharecropping trap. The second dire option was the convict lease system that let southern states arrest blacks and lease them out indefinitely without a trial and without pay to former slave owners and factory owners. Although the 13th Amendment barred slavery except as a punishment for a crime, Confederates used this language in the law to arrest blacks en masse and return them to what most people would call slavery. In Alabama alone, over 200,000 blacks toiled for no pay in mines, on plantations, and in factories rebuilding the South in white wealth. Of course, this was kept out of our history books. The book Slavery by Another Name by Douglas A. Blackman, or watch his documentary of the same title. And you may question whether slavery really ended after the Civil War, or whether, as law professor Brian Stevenson suggests, it simply evolved. Regardless, the promise of freedom was once again deferred. And the end of Reconstruction was very tragic for blacks, but few were prepared for the nadir of American race relations. Now, nadir means lowest point, the depths of despair. It describes the years between 1877 to about 1940. It was a time of enforcement of Jim Crow laws and the establishment of all-white sundown towns. During the nadir, segregation increased everywhere, especially after the separate but equal Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. The Klan rose to a zenith, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy built hundreds of Confederate monuments all over the country. There were numerous race riots. In 1921, America's Black Wall Street, one of the most prominent concentrations of African American wealth in the United States, was destroyed by white mobs. Now, Black Wall Street had a theater that seated 750 patrons, hospitals, upscale restaurants, dance halls, a skating rink, posh hotels, and every kind of professional business ranging from dentists to lawyers. Black Wall Street should have been the pride of America. Every governor should have wanted to replicate it. Blacks proved that if you just gave them some land and allowed them the freedom to be self-sufficient like whites, they would excel too. In every place that blacks were given land and allowed to prosper, they did so. In Richmond, Virginia, blacks established a bustling business district, boasting their own newspapers, banks, and department stores. In Durham, North Carolina, over 200 black-owned businesses lined the street. Sweet Auburn Avenue in Atlanta was once dubbed the richest Negro street in the world. Wilmington, North Carolina was called the freest town for blacks in the country. Blacks built businesses, churches, homes, and other community institutions everywhere they were allowed to. Why didn't we learn that in our history classes? That's why history matters. That's why history matters. Unfortunately, during the nadir, Jim Crow won the day because no matter where blacks were in the US, whenever they managed to accumulate wealth and property, it was destroyed, and the promise of freedom was once again deferred. See, it's because of this history of slavery, segregation, and violence that we're still fighting for diversity and inclusion today. But despite this painful picture, Juneteenth also reminds us that blacks played an extraordinary role in preserving the Union as they fought and died for a freedom that many never experienced. Lincoln called the colored troops his black warriors and proclaimed that the Civil War could not have been won without them. The multiracial democracy that existed for a brief moment during Reconstruction showed us what is possible. The abolitionists and white civil rights activists taught us what it means to have genuine white allies. That's why Juneteenth is also a time of joy, because it represents what should be, with its hope of a better tomorrow, and explains why our ancestors still sang in the dark times. Juneteenth is a day to remember the bravery of many people who fought for justice, from those who worked to end slavery to those in this room who helped make this day a national holiday. And I wish I had a happy ending for you, but anti-black racism is on the rise.
Yes, it is.
This country is still divided, and the future of our democracy is not guaranteed. That's why we must study history to learn its lessons. While this history may be painful, this does not have to be a time of despair, because we are standing on the shoulders of our forebears who cleared a path for us. And you won't find their names in history books, but their children are in this room. And if the brutal treatment they received couldn't crush their spirits, then we too must continue to sing. And as we honor Juneteenth, let's pledge to work for a country that truly reflects the freedom and equality this day represents. So let's go forward with hope, knowing the heroic struggle and unrelenting spirit of our ancestors won't allow us to give in to defeat. If we do this, we will make sure Juneteenth's promise of freedom someday becomes a reality. Thank you.
All right.